Thank you all for coming. My name is Ed Rubin. I'm one of the faculty members here in Engineering and Public Policy and Mechanical Engineering. And I was asked to introduce Joe because he was a student here about the time I started my career as a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon. Just a couple of years ago. And I've got to tell you, it's really a truly delight. Anybody who's been in a faculty position knows that one of the really true delightful parts of this job is seeing success in people we've had the pleasure of working with as students. And so I couldn't be more proud of Joe and grateful for the opportunity to introduce him to you. He did his bachelor's degree here in chemical engineering and a master's degree in what is currently the Heinz School. At the time Joe was here, it was the School of Urban and Public Affairs, SUPA. After leaving CMU, Joe went to Washington, where he has been a significant force for several decades now. He went to work first for the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. I first heard Joe's name actually some years later from some folks at DOE, the Department of Energy. I don't know if I ever told you this, Joe. Joe was someone in DOE circles who is held in great respect and great awe. He was the budget manager at OMB that oversaw their programs. And so Joe was a well-respected person in DOE. Feared is probably too strong a word, but respected to the highest extent because they knew they couldn't get anything past Joe that didn't deserve to be. So he was a public servant for many years at OMB. He did some stints and others. There's a long bio sketch in the introduction. I won't bother repeating all of that. He did along the way I want to make sure I get the name of it right, the President's Outstanding Federal Executive Award in 1989. He then went on to be a vice president and director of a well-respected consulting firm. This was the EOP group. I ran into Joe again during his time there in some work we were doing at the university here that needed some high-level policy advice and expertise, and all fingers, again, and all voices pointed to Joe as the go-to person for there. He had a long and very distinguished career at EOP before taking what to me sounds more like a little sabbatical. He went to MIT for a while to run a study on the future of solar energy. And I expect it was there, Joe, isn't that right, that he got to know much better someone named Ernie Moniz, who went on to be nominated and appointed as the Secretary of Energy under the Obama administration. It was just a few months later that Ernie persuaded Joe to come join him back in Washington as the Chief Financial Officer of DOE. As he may tell you, the DOE is a much broader organization with a lot more responsibilities and a lot of kinds of things that we normally do here. I can tell you he's got a wonderful corner office that obviously understates the status of that position. And I can tell you I've heard nothing but praise and kind words from high-level folks at DOE for the job Joe has done over the last 2 years in that position. So with that, let me stop and turn the floor over to Joe Hezir and ask me to join you in welcoming him to Carnegie Mellon.
Thanks, Ed. I think as all of you know, students, that during the course of your time here, you find that you come in contact with a lot of faculty members, and I'm sure you find over your years here, there's a few that you find that you find most helpful. You find to have been some of your best teachers as well as some of your best advisors, And during my years here, when I was in Carnegie Mellon, I was an undergraduate in the chemical engineering department, but my interests were much broader than that. It was in the earlier days, it was the pre-engineering and public policy program. It didn't actually formally exist when I was here. But I was working with professors in other departments, and Ed was in the mechanical engineering department and working on a lot of air quality issues, was one of the people that I was doing some project work and got to know, and I've always viewed him as sort of one of my mentors here. So so I appreciate the introduction. What I would like to do today, I mean, and again, just to kind of give you, to start off by just saying a little bit about where I'm coming from, my background, you know, and my engineering career was relatively short, but my public policy career was much longer. And so the kinds of things, particularly that I've been doing in the last almost 4 years now at the Department of Energy, I initially helped then Secretary Moniz when he came in doing his transition planning, and then served as a kind of a senior advisor on a lot of strategic issues and working with him on strategic planning, and then ultimately moving into the CFO function. So I come to you speaking from a perspective of kind of a senior policy advisor, strategic planner, and kind of a budget planner, and that's sort of the perspective I want to take today. So I know many of you, you know, and either directly or indirectly may be benefiting in some fashion from some federal funding, either coming to you directly or through some of your professors. And so what I want to do is talk to you at a higher level plane, talking to you a little bit about the framework for how at least within DOE, we put together our budget, and how we put together the framework of the programs and the budgets that ultimately leads to sort of the waterfall flow of the money that ultimately comes to places like here. One other thing I would just say by way of introduction is that in terms of the overall the Department of Energy, the word energy sometimes is a little bit of a misnomer. We're a $30 billion cabinet agency, but roughly only $10 billion of the $30 billion is really in the fields of energy and science. The other 20 is a combination. It's the nuclear weapons program and the environmental cleanup program associated with the post-World War nuclear weapons program. And so that, in terms of the budget, that's the biggest slice of it. But the most interesting piece is the piece I'm going to talk about, which is really the science and energy piece, which is about 10 billion. And so just to start off, I would just say there's really three main messages that I really wanted to convey today as I go through this presentation. One is, and I think you all know that because that's why you're here, is the importance of and the need for innovation in the energy space. The second sort of overarching message that I want to really talk about a little bit is what we refer to as mission innovation, which is a initiative that got started last year to really ramp up the pace, the scale, and the scope of at least governmental investment on the governmental side in energy technologies. And really the third thing that I'll go into, and this part of it is really kind of a work in progress because it's not yet finished, is some of the work that we're currently doing to try and put together a new portfolio framework for how, at least at the department level, we plan and hope budget and hopefully will implement our energy innovation programs as we go forward. So let me start off. This is sort of something I think you all know, and I was thinking about these first two slides, and I think if I were a advisor to President-elect Trump, this is probably where I would start with him, and that saying that basically to think about innovation as really the engine of economic growth. And so if you really are interested in economic growth, you really need to be thinking about innovation. And there's a large body of literature that has documented this over the years in terms of the connection between innovation, productivity growth, and ultimately GDP growth, and also job creation. Although, as I say, in terms of job creation, it's not, there's always new jobs created, but it's not necessarily always a net gain. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. The other thing that I would have said to a President-elect Trump is that not only is innovation important, but and innovation broadly speaking, but the government's role in the innovation process is very important in terms of the public investment that goes into R&D. And again, there's a few quotes here, and again, many studies have documented this in terms of the benefits of government R&D, in terms of the federal role, in terms of dealing with some of the externality issues that the market doesn't obviously price fully, or issues related to spillover benefits that, or benefits that are non-appropriable to an individual firm, and sort of the broader social rate of return, which is in many cases much higher than just the private rate of investment return. And so this is why I think why the Department of Energy exists, quite frankly, why we are in the business of trying to promote innovation, is to try and bring some of these benefits to the U.S. economy. Now, this next slide here shows where we have been in recent years. And if you go back and look pretty much over the last decade in clean energy technology areas, whether it's wind, solar, electric vehicles, photovoltaics, what we've seen is tremendous progress in terms of significant reductions in cost and rapid ramp up in market penetration. And this is a combination of two factors, really. It's sort of the combination of many R&D investments over a long period of time in these technology areas. But what really also made a big difference here was that going back to the period, if you will, of the Great Recession and the beginning of the Obama administration, there were many new federal incentives that were put in place. Some of them were part of the Recovery Act, some of them were tax credits, and that really spurred this significant growth in deployment. And so to put this in an innovation context, it really was the culmination of a lot of R&D, but it was also, when you look at the cost reductions and the market penetration, it's really, in an innovation paradigm, this is really learning by using, where by getting things into the marketplace, we learned a lot very quickly about how to reduce costs and make things work much better. So much so that in some of the recent debates about clean energy and climate change, there's a group of proponents who have argued that, well, geez, when you look at these graphs, you know, we're doing so well, we don't really need any more innovation. All we need to do is just keep deploying what we currently have, and we'll make, great progress in terms of clean energy deployment and reductions in greenhouse gas. But in fact, while we've made a lot of progress, that's really not true. This is another graph, and again, this is a very simple summary of a lot of modeling analysis that we've been doing in the department. And actually, I'll mention this later at the end of my presentation. This will be part of a report that will be coming out next week, as a matter of fact, where we've looking out to mid-century, and if the goal is to achieve, again, to meet climate goals, to achieve deep decarbonization of the economy, where we are today in terms of the current status of our technologies is it's not good enough to get there. And in fact, the other interesting point on this chart is that when you look at things that might be done in order to try and get to deep decarbonization, and by the way, when people talk about deep decarbonization, they usually mean a reduction of about 80% of greenhouse gases by mid-century is kind of the benchmark for that. What's really interesting on this chart is if you look at the middle line, the dashed line, is it just says if you just impose the carbon charge, and then this is a relatively modest charge here of a starting off at $10 a ton that ramps up over time. Or wait a minute, I forget which case we used there. Was that the $10 case or $20 case? I'm sorry. And it ramps up at over time. It does buy you additional reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but if you were to combine that modest carbon charge with a very aggressive technology innovation program, where if you really thought you could take where we currently are in terms of the state of our technologies and make additional improvements, you get a synergistic effect. And you're able to get those kinds of deep decarbonization at relatively modest cost of carbon. And so you're not necessarily imposing a very high cost of carbon on the economy, but rather taking advantage of the leveraging effect between innovation and some modest carbon pricing. And so I think that's really, as I said, the first message I wanted to convey, why we need additional innovation. So let me go on to sort of my second message, which is mission innovation. Mission innovation was an initiative that was announced in Paris almost a year ago. It was the end of November of last year at the climate change conference that took place, the Council Parties 21 in Paris. And basically what happened was 20 countries voluntarily agreed to make a commitment to double their level of government funding in clean energy technology over the next 5 years. And the objective here, obviously, as I said up on top, was to really accelerate the pace and the scope of clean energy technology innovation. And then each of the 20 countries, and I'll show you the map here in a moment, would make its own plans for how they were going to do this. This was not going to be a kind of a joint program, but rather a collaborative or coordinated program where each country would adapt its own program to its own needs. And also another big aspect of this, which I'll talk about in a minute, was the idea was to sort of fill the innovation pipeline with more new ideas that would bring private sector investment. And although mission innovation was announced in connection with the climate conference, clearly climate was the major driver in the sense that the ministers, including Secretary Moniz, felt that having an important announcement on innovation was important for many of these other countries to have to encourage greater ambition in terms of them setting their future climate goals, just as I showed you in that chart in terms of what could be done. But clearly, as I showed you in the first chart, doing mission innovation has benefits much more than climate. So these are the 20 countries that are participating in mission innovation. And starting from the bullets at the bottom, we span 5 continents, and it's 60% of the world's population, including the 5 most populous countries in the world. The participating countries account for 2/3 of greenhouse gases and nearly 3/4 of the CO2 emissions from electricity. And it's roughly represents 70% of global GDP and 80% of all current government-wide funding for clean energy R&D, as best we can estimate. And among these 20 countries is very interesting in terms of their current energy baselines, if you will, that there are a small number of these countries that get a substantial fraction of their electricity from hydro, but there's a large number that are dependent on fossil fuels, and so the issue of getting to clean energy is going to be very important for them. We also have some developing countries in this mix as well. And I just kind of as a sidebar note here, the whole idea of the mission innovation, the prime mover behind all of this was Bill Gates. And about early 2015, he went to the president He also personally lobbied President Hollande of France and Prime Minister Modi of India. And it was really those three leaders that really got the ball rolling on this and ultimately got the other countries to agree to participate. So for the developing country side, clean energy technology innovation becomes extremely important, because when you look at, again, many of you may have seen this graph in other contexts, when you look at electricity consumption and its correlation with human development, it's a very interesting correlation. And for some of the developing countries, what we really want to do is to have them move up the y-axis on the steepest possible slope. And that's really, again, where innovation comes into play. And again, just to show you that, most of the developing countries, there's a wide spread in terms of their current per capita electricity. And then you have this this middle group here, and then you have the some of these lesser developed countries. And so what we really want to do is to be able to create the technology options for them to really advance up that y-axis, as I said, without moving very far out the x-axis. So this is the ministers that are involved in mission innovation met for the first time this spring. I think it was in May in San Francisco, and provided some additional information on what their current budgets were and their current baselines, and it adds up to about $15 billion. The U.S. component of that, which I'll show you more about in a moment, is about 40%. It's around 6, it's a little less than half. And the idea is to kind of ramp up to a level of 30 billion after 5 years. And then when you look at the kind of the area under the curve, that's a significant increment of potentially new resources that can be brought to bear to investment in the energy innovation space. And so the other thing I wanted just to point out here is that why a doubling? And again, going back to the second chart I showed you, that clearly there's a case to be made that the benefits of investment in this area exceeds the cost. But we've had several studies in recent years, including the American Innovation Council, and a study that was also done by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, that really pointed out and tried to make a case that not only were we underinvesting, but we were underinvesting by a factor of 2 to 3. And so that really kind of laid some of the intellectual predicate for mission innovation. The other interesting thing about it was that one of the prime movers behind the American Energy Innovation Council also was Bill Gates. And so it was really Gates's involvement in this first study that really led him to conclude that we really needed to do much more in this space, as well as some of the work that obviously that he's done through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where they've looked at some of the issues in the developing countries. And the other parallel effort with the mission innovation that was also announced in the Paris Agreement was something called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And again, this was another Bill Gates initiative where he personally reached out to all of these individuals, each of whom is, I imagine each one is probably a billionaire, and got them to agree that they'd be willing to pledge a certain amount of their personal net worth toward investing in new technologies that would be created by this mission innovation pipeline. What was interesting about this commitment from the Breakthrough Energy Coalition was that the monies that would go into this would not be your typical monies that would come through normal investment vehicles like venture capital funds and be subject to the normal rules that apply to venture capital funds, but rather these were going to be personal monies, patient capital, recognizing that there was going to take much longer to create profitable investments in some of these energy technologies, and maybe what many people have been experiencing in the information technology world. So for example, and again, also the other thing that's very interesting about the Breakthrough Energy Coalition members is there's a few people in that group, like people like a Tom Steyer or a John Doerr, who are very experienced investors, venture capital investors in the energy space. But there's many others, including like a Mark Zuckerberg, whose knowledge of energy technology and energy innovation is probably, next to none, but was willing to participate. So what the group is going to do, and this is something that will probably become public here in the next month, is that they will announce that they're forming their own fund that will be a fund for private investment that will be complementary to the government investment in mission innovation. And one of the things that and again, in having discussions with some of the members, the staff people working on this, in designing this fund, it's not going to be your typical venture capital fund, which is, in many of these venture capital funds, they'll have like a 10-year time horizon where there's a 5-year investment period, and then the second 5 years is where you make all your money back. They're looking at an investment fund that's probably going to have a time horizon at least twice that. And again, I think it's just a recognition of some of the additional challenges in the energy space in bringing new technology from the research phase into the market. So from that, I'd like now to maybe transition sort of into the third message I really wanted to talk about, which is what the U.S. is doing, and in particular, what the Department of Energy is doing. When we made this announcement last November, we established our own baseline, and in the U.S. government it was $6.4 billion, of which the Department of Energy was $4.8. The other major players in this are the National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Defense, and small amounts from a few other agencies. And we defined our baseline looking at what we are currently spending on RD&D, research, development, and demonstration activities. We did not include, within the Department of Energy in particular, we have a lot of investments that we call deployment, which we did not include in our base. So we were proposing to, in the case of DOE, proposing to double from a $4.8 billion baseline. The other thing that we did very early on is the question of scope. And we adopted this definition of what a clean energy technology is. And we wanted to make it clear that the clean energy technology could be at any stage of the energy cycle, as long as its application would reduce net greenhouse gases and would, let's see if I can get, and have one of the other following characteristics. Environmental characteristics, including reduced demand for water, waste, reduced other emissions, etc. And I want to emphasize here, by defining clean energy technology this way, we are not defining clean energy technology as renewable energy. That nuclear energy and coal with carbon capture are very integral parts of the mix here and going forward. So, as I mentioned to you, the announcement of the mission innovation was put together in November. Between November and February, we literally had 2.5 months before we put together our fiscal year 2017 budget, which went to Congress in February of this year. And so we were scrambling very hard to put together an initial budget that would show an initial trajectory toward a doubling. And what we did is we put together a budget, if you start down at the bottom right-hand corner, that showed a 21% increase over the base year, which was FY 2016. The FY 2016 number, as I said, is $4.8 billion. And if you look at down at the bottom row first, what I wanted to point out is if you look at the Department of Energy's science and energy portfolio, it's about $10 billion. And of the $10 billion, we are counting about half of it, or a little bit more, toward our Mission Innovation Pledge. And the reason for this is that the other half involves things like some of our basic science work, like high energy physics, nuclear physics. It involves some of the deployment programs, things like subsidies for transportation deployment and things like that, and other programs like weatherization grants, regulatory programs, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look across the pieces of it, oh, let me go back. I thought this was animated. Sorry. On the left-hand column, excuse all the acronyms, but I'll explain them in a moment. These are our major organizations within DOE. Within each organization, we had to go through a careful parsing to determine what part of the base was mission innovation, and then also how we would prioritize increases within each of those areas. So, for example, the top line there is our EERE, which is energy efficiency and renewable energy portfolio, which when we went through the analysis of what's RD&D and what's not, it was about 2/3 is RD&D, and when you look at what we propose in the FY17 budget, that piece of it, we proposed a 50% increase. If you look, contrast that to the next to the bottom line, which is the SC line, which is the Office of Science. The Office of Science has a number of programs in the discovery science area that really are not part of the energy portfolio. It's really, particle physics research and things of that nature. And so the base in that is less than 1/3 of the total, and the increase there was much lower. ARPA-E, which is a relatively new organization, basically its entire mission is focused on the energy innovation space, and that also went up by 20%. The other reason I want to show you this chart, and again, not to focus on the numbers, but to focus on the organization. The way the department does its budget and the way we implement our program by these offices, EERE is energy efficiency, renewable energy, Office of OE is Office of Electricity, FE is fossil energy, NE is nuclear energy, ARPA-E and science. The applied energy programs are all organized, budgeted, and implemented by type of fuel. And so what we really want to do in thinking ahead on mission innovation is also begin to think about constructing a portfolio that moves away from a fuel-based structure, because it's really not the right way to be thinking about the problem, quite frankly. But it's the way we've inherited it, and it's been this way since the late 1970s when the Department of Energy was first formed. And it really creates very what I call non-optimal allocations, which is a euphemism for saying political allocations. For example, the secretary will go before Congress and be testifying on the budget, and we'll get questions like, well, you increased the renewable energy budget by X, and you only increased the coal budget by Y, and why is it that you're doing that without looking at what it is that you're actually buying? It's all sort of input focused rather than output focused. And so while we didn't have time to do this and we did the FY17 budget, what we've been doing over the past year is beginning to think about a transition from how we think about our programs and budgets, and particularly as we start thinking about if we're serious about really picking up the pace of our innovation efforts. And so there have been a few small steps in this direction. Clearly, at the end of the Clinton administration, then Secretary Moniz was at DOE as the undersecretary, and he did a portfolio review back then and identified that we had a big gap in terms of the programs that we had in electricity transmission and distribution, because everything was focused on the fuel source. And so we established, back then was when the Office of Electricity was established. Likewise, ARPA-E was established by statute in 2007. It was a recommendation that originally came from the National Academy of Sciences, of which the study director is sitting here in the first row. A very good recommendation. And again, it also established both a new business model in terms of how we do research, but it also set up an organization that really looked across all sectors of the energy spectrum. And then in 2014, DOE produced a report called the Quadrennial Technology Review, which was also a step where we began to look at our portfolio, not from the standpoint of its fuel or energy resource standpoint, but from the basis of its application. And so, while we're starting from a initial year and a baseline on a fuel-based organization, we're in the process right now of trying to transition this more toward an application-based structure. And so what does that mean? Well, as a starting point, we went back to the 2014 DOE study of the Quadrennial Technology Review. And again, this is a very high-level framing, but basically saying, well, look, if you're looking at it from an application standpoint, in the energy space, what we have is electricity systems, we have fuels, we have various markets where end-use markets of energy utilization, and then we do have some various cross-cutting and supporting type research capabilities. And so if we kind of start with this thinking, where would this lead us to? And so what we're beginning to do right now in terms of putting together a more detailed portfolio plan, and what we're trying to do is put together a 5-year plan that we would leave behind for the Trump administration to implement. We are beginning to put it together in this framework. And it's causing a lot of very interesting internal discussions. And so we're starting off by saying, okay, if we're going to double our portfolio, where do you put your money? And of course, you start off by saying, well, where's been your biggest payoffs? What seems to be working well? And that's the things you want to start off with funding. So let me walk you through some of the programs and not only the programs themselves, but also the different models that we've been using to fund research and the ones that we're going to look to emphasize more in our mission innovation portfolio. And first and foremost here, we have ARPA-E. ARPA-E was set up, I guess it was part of the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report. And it was in the Authorizing the America Competes Act, and it was first funded as part of the Recovery Act. And really what ARPA-E does, it's based on a organization in the Defense Department called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a very small, lean, very nimble organization with term-limited appointments, where people focus on trying to find transformational technology opportunities that are very high risk, very high payoff, and say, okay, let's put a little bit of money into this, give it a few years, and let's see if it's going to work. And then you sort of get in and get out, and if it succeeds, hopefully then it'll take off. And I did do a little investigation before I came here, and I think, and Debbie confirmed this morning, I think in the university here there's probably 4 or 6 ARPA-E projects, 6 out of 475. And so right now we've invested $1.3 billion in those projects, and ARPA-E's only been in existence now, really its first funding was in 2009, so it's only been in existence for about 8 years. So it's really, in the first round of projects, really, by the time it got stood up and implemented, we're only beginning to see kind of the results of what's being funded there. And so far, what we found is that of the 200 projects that have been completed, 45 have gone on to attract follow-on funding. 35 have led to the formation of new companies. We've actually had 8 projects that have now led to commercial sales of new products and technologies, and another 60 that have ended up partnering. Maybe you've gotten some follow-on funding from another DOE program or another federal agency. And right now that program is at $291 million. We're trying to ramp it up by 20% by 350. But the National Academy of Sciences, when they recommended this program, said that really its ultimate level should be about $1 billion, which is roughly, more than a 3x over where it is today. And that's really what we're hoping to project when we go out over the next 5 years. And I think one of the most interesting indicators of the capacity of this program to do more is the program funds both focus solicitations where they might identify a technology area, but they also do what's called open solicitations where anybody can come in with a proposal for anything. And in the open solicitations, the success rate has been about 2%. And we think there's a lot of very good ideas that are being left on the table there for lack of money. Another area that we've want to emphasize are we called Energy Frontier Research Centers. And these are more in the kind of the spectrum of research, more on the basic research side, but they're what we call use-inspired research in the sense that they're basic research needs, but their basic research need is identified by a particular issue or problem. Whether it's like photovoltaic materials, for example, or something like that. These centers also have been fairly new, and they're typically much smaller. They're not individual PIs, but rather small investigator groups, typically small collaborations. If it's a university-based center, it might be 3 to 5 investigators and a group of graduate students, and they're usually funded at several $1 million a year, and they typically have about a 5-year time horizon. Again, we originally funded a number of these centers, and to date they've led to a large number of research publications. Again, the appropriate metric here, because these are more basic research type activities, but also a number of new invention disclosures, and also some very significant translation into actual applications with individual companies, including some startups. We currently have 36 EFRCs funded. I did check, and none of them are at Carnegie Mellon. But in looking at capacity building, our Office of Science believes that there's the potential here that to easily fund as many as 60 of these centers. And so that's another area that we will be looking to increase. This is just a chart here that shows where the centers are currently located across the country. And down at the bottom is a little pie chart that shows who the lead institution is. And as I said, most of these centers are based at universities. I think I repeated that. And then this is just an example of the types of projects that are going on at these centers to give you a flavor of the connection between the sort of the application and sort of the basic research need. So there's things like catalysis here, materials, some fundamental questions of like biomass conversion, that sort of thing. So let me go on then to talk about another area that we want to emphasize in going forward is something called energy innovation hubs. This is also a new research model that was started during the Obama administration. And these are much larger research collaborations, typically $25 million a year. And so far there have been we have one in critical materials, we have one in nuclear reactor modeling and simulation, one in battery and energy storage, and one in sunlight to fuels. And we have a new one that's proposed in the budget looking at water purification. We call it desalination hub for shorthand, but it really is intended to look at a variety of impaired waters and how they can be beneficially improved inexpensively and efficiently. The interesting thing about these hubs is that because of their scale, they end up becoming centered at some of our national laboratories, which have more of the scale to do this kind of work, although they are competitively selected. And again, this is another area that we're hoping to expand, particularly to get one started on the energy water nexus here in the course of the next year. And then also in our department, we started another new initiative we started was advanced manufacturing, which was creating advanced manufacturing centers. Again, these tended to be collaborations, in many cases centered at a national laboratory or a university. And these were much more applied. They tended to be places where manufacturing technologies would be prototyped, or where there would be more a combination of research and technical assistance. We're doing one, the Power America one is dealing with power electronics. The Oak Ridge manufacturing facility is focused on 3D printing. The Critical Materials Hub is looking at both combinations of substitutes for rare earth materials in energy components, as well as finding new ways to recover rare earth materials from other resources. And so this is another area that, again, has gotten a lot of interest. It's another area that we're looking to expand in what would be a new portfolio. What's interesting about all of these is that they're all cross-cutting. So we're not talking here about solar or coal or anything per se, but rather, again, trying to look at it from a sort of a problem-solving aspect. And another thing that we've done in the department since Secretary Moniz has been there is that, again, we've been trying to break down these organizational silos in terms of their fuel-based organization. And so he's identified 6 areas that we've been working on that are cross-cutting areas of science and technology that have applications in many different areas. So, for example, subsurface science and technology, there's issues there related to fracking. There's issues there related to underground disposal of nuclear waste. There's science and technologies related to geothermal energy development. And what we're trying to do then is to take those common set of science and technology issues and kind of take a holistic look at them, recognizing then from there they'll spin out to various applications. The supercritical CO2 one is maybe a little more narrowly defined. That's really looking at coming up with a new power conversion cycle based on supercritical CO2 as the working fluid in a Brayton cycle that might replace conventional steam turbines for thermal power generation, which currently are based on the Rankine cycle. Grid modernization is one where we have a consortium of national laboratories looking at a variety of technologies for both in the transmission and distribution system space, and not only the technologies themselves, but how they might work together. Exascale computing right now is probably, in the Secretary's mind, the single most important thing that he hopes to leave behind, where we are embarking on a new initiative that would ramp these numbers up by a factor of 2 to 3 to try and create an exascale computing capability in place by the early part of the next decade. From where we are right now, we need to increase speeds by about 5 times to get from where we are right now at petascale to exascale. Advanced materials is another area that we're looking at as a cross-cutting area, and there we're focusing in on high temperature and materials that are in extreme environments. In other words, this could be materials that might have applications in heat exchangers, as well as materials that would be in energy conversion, as well as other types of materials. So the interesting thing about these crosscuts is that when you look at the total funding there, it's about $1 billion. And so roughly right now, we've now begun to move about 10% of our portfolio, of our fuel-based portfolio, into these cross-cutting categories. And typically, in any one of these initiative areas, we may have as many as at least 3, as many as 5 or 6 different departmental organizations involved in teams trying to plan and execute these programs. And so another new initiative, and one that I've personally been spending a lot of time working on over the last year that we're trying to launch, is called Regional Innovation Partnerships. And again, the goal here is to look at innovation at innovation issues at a regional level rather than a national level. And we put $110 million to try and get this program started in the budget this year. If we are successful, the ultimate scale of this program could easily be $500 million a year. Over the course of the past year, we had 14 separate university-hosted workshops to explore various issues in the regional innovation space. We had one at the University of Pittsburgh. We did not have one here. We had one at West Virginia University, but people from Carnegie Mellon participated in those. And I want to talk a little bit more about what this really means, because I think this is a new initiative and one that we think has a lot of promise for how we do innovation. It's basically a new model for how we do business. And first of all, I just show you a couple of quotes here. The National Research Council has had several reports where they've endorsed this concept. One in 2012 and another one more recently for electricity in 2016. And I'm not going to read these quotes, but the idea is to create a regional innovation ecosystem. We have kind of 2 models for these right now in the country. Clearly, Silicon Valley is one such innovation ecosystem. It's not an energy innovation ecosystem, but it's a technology innovation ecosystem. And we have really one in New England based in the based around Boston. And so what we've done, and is try to do some work internally on, first of all, defining what is a innovation ecosystem. And an innovation ecosystem is something that, let's see if I'm very bad at animation here, so let me just show you the whole slide, that sort of combines a number of factors. You have a networking factor, which is not shown in those circles, which is typically a university or a group of universities. You have a group of large companies, you have a group of startup companies, and you have a private investment community that's willing to put money into it, and you have a local and state policy environment that's encouraging the innovation. And you bring those factors together, and that really begins to form an ecosystem that really feeds on itself. And we've been using a kind of a knowledge-based tool to begin to try and identify, looking at data, this is sort of a big data analytics project, where these kinds of things currently exist. And on the right-hand side, you'll see one example in solar energy that's sort of formed around the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Golden, Colorado, that sort of has all of these ingredients. You have a national laboratory that is focused on research in renewable energy. You have, the big companies, you have the smaller companies, you have the sort of the incubator space, and you have investors. And we're beginning to see, again, some of the metrics there in the green in terms of funding and results that the ecosystem is beginning to create. And so the whole idea of the regional partnerships is to provide federal seed money to create more of these types of ecosystems across the country. And our idea for how we would design these is that, first of all, we're looking at much broader regions, not just simply metropolitan areas, but rather potentially multi-state areas. And that what we're looking to do is to have organizations formed that would be sort of not-for-profit entities that we would select competitively, that would be consortia of government agencies, laboratories, universities, and companies that would begin to try and put together planning and programming for that region. And depending on the program that they put together then, and again, they would have broad latitude to identify the priorities for that region depending upon the energy resources in that region, the energy applications in that region, and the scientific and technological capabilities of that region. And so, for example, you could see something in this region that would look very different than, for example, something that would be based in Texas. Not going into all the details. But the idea then would be for DOE to promote these partnerships by, in essence, giving them a block grant. So rather than funding individual projects or individual awards, basically saying, you put together a program of research, you decide who's going to do that research, and we will write you one check, and then you decide and you select who you want to do that. The other part of this idea in the last bullet there is, in the last two bullets I should say, is that also by creating these ecosystems, they're not going to be successful unless they also bring in private sector investment. And so the idea would be that while this would not necessarily be federally funded, that they could reach out and draw upon state programs and private sector investment to complement the federal funding that goes into the partnership. I must say right now this is a kind of a heavy lift trying to start a new program in a Congress that's about to end, but we're still hopeful that we could maybe get something started here that will have some legs to it. And then last but not least, going back to my portfolio concept, what we also are now beginning to do is take all of our traditional programs within the Department of Energy and begin to put them into these application type buckets and begin to think about how we would prioritize investments in those areas. So for example, if one were looking at clean power generation, what we really want to be thinking about is the nuclear space as well as the renewables, as well as some of the high energy efficiency conversion. If we're looking at obviously the power system, it's the grid and it's storage. If we're looking at clean fuels, we're looking at things like biomass conversion to drop-in fuels as well as new fuels such as hydrogen. And by beginning to think about it in this context, we're trying to put together right now the metrics to think about, again, with an additional dollar of investment, where's the best place to put that dollar? In the energy utilization space, again, that one is much more straightforward. You're looking at building systems, you're looking at industry, and you're looking at transportation. But one of the interesting things that's sort of emerging from our current thinking about this as we begin to think about applications is we're beginning to think more about systems level issues. Again, I would say one of the other shortcomings of our current programs and organization is we think about and we fund individual technologies. And so in the buildings area, we have programs in HVAC, we have programs in lighting, we have programs looking at the efficiency of building shells, we have programs looking at glazing technologies, but we haven't really thought about how one integrates buildings, and then taking it even a step larger, how one thinks about systems at a community or metropolitan area. We have a little bit of money in the budget, and we were talking about this morning for a metropolitan systems program, but that also would be a new start. And really what we're finding now, what we're thinking is that we really need to do more of this, but what we're finding is, if you look at our current organizational structure, we don't have a place to put it. We don't have a current champion, we don't have a current program office that can actually do this work. And so one of the outcomes of beginning to think about a different portfolio is we need to also now be thinking about a different management organization. Likewise, in the transportation area, we think about vehicle efficiency. We have programs looking at engine efficiency. We have programs looking at lightweighting vehicles. Obviously, in the electrification sector, we're looking at, the power systems as well as the batteries. But we're really not thinking about transportation as mobility. And again, we've had some very interesting discussions internally about this, and saying that, well, look, we're really sort of not really thinking about, if you're really thinking about energy efficient transportation, you need to think about mobility in a much broader sense. And so, again, just as a sidebar, we had one meeting when we had the discussion of this, and then our assistant secretary for energy efficiency and renewable energy comes into the next meeting with the secretary and says, we really need to do more in this area, but I don't have a place to do it. And so again, we're beginning to think about how we organize ourselves going forward to think about how we can better deal with some of these systems areas. The other thing we're thinking about, obviously, is, and I went through these examples of kind of these cross-cutting and supporting research activities. But one other area that again, it's kind of a gap, if you will, in terms of the things that the department is currently doing, is looking at carbon management in a more bigger sense, I should say, in novel ways. We currently spend very little, if any, money looking at beneficial utilization of CO2. I mean, our focus right now is either putting it in geologic storage or using it for enhanced oil recovery. But other uses don't really get much attention. Likewise, the opportunity, if we're, again, looking ahead mid-century, if we're looking at something for deep decarbonization, would we want to try and think of something that would involve biologic based energy with carbon capture that might actually produce negative CO2? And then likewise, last but not least, and this is probably the biggest reach, would be carbon capture from dilute sources. Right now, obviously, given the state of the art of the technology and given the economics, you want to focus on the most concentrated sources of CO2 for capture. But again, if you're looking longer term and at much higher levels of being able to capture carbon, you need to be thinking about you need to be having a wider lens, if you will, a broader aperture in terms of thinking about technologies. And so that's some of the things we're currently doing. This last chart I want to show you this is a work in progress. This is kind of an internal planning chart that we're currently working on that's intended to bring together all of these pieces. And again, I won't go through all the details other than to point out that what we've tried to do, looking at the very top line, is if you start looking at electric power, fuels, and end uses, and begin to think about the categories of applications and where current programs fit. The color coding shows where current programs, those are current organizations within DOE, and the legend for that's down on the right-hand side. So, for example, the green is the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and the purple is the Office of Science, and the bottom one is Office of Electricity. And so what we're seeing is, as we begin to think about this in a different way, we begin to see how our current organization is a bit fragmented in terms of how we approach this. This is going to be an interesting discussion with the Trump transition team in terms of how they might want to think about managing the Department of Energy going forward. But it's beginning also, I think, to have a beneficial impact in getting people to think differently and work together in a different way, and just like the crosscuts have. But it's also helpful in thinking this way to begin to identify, when you look at the population of these boxes, where the money's currently going and where there's gaps. So, for example, again, just to show you what that chart means, is the two numbers in each of those boxes. One of them is the FY 2016 budget in that area, and the second number is the FY 2017 budget. And what we're trying to do right now is add a third number to that budget at least, which would be a potential budget for FY 2018. The other thing I'll show you at the very top of that chart there, and you look at the application areas, is we overlaid the 2015 CO2 emissions associated with those sectors. So again, beginning to think about where the application is, what the technologies that would contribute to those applications, and how those areas impact CO2 emissions. And obviously there's a lot of analysis behind it, but I just wanted to show this one chart so you can get a sense of how we're beginning to try and bring things together in a different way. So let me just talk here as sort of concluding comments. Two things. One is, what are our challenges? And so we have two major challenges as we begin to think about how we plan this portfolio. One is, how do you evaluate competing technologies and how you identify performance metrics? If we're going to put more money, for example, into advanced nuclear reactor research, for example, how does that compare to putting more money into offshore wind technology? Second one we're dealing with is budget constraints. The whole premise behind mission innovation is that we're going to be able to, or we're going to seek to double the level of funding in this space over the next 5 years. However, we're trying to do that within a budgetary environment that's very different, that's actually sloping in the opposite direction. Federal discretionary spending as a total has been going down as a percent of GDP, and current statutory caps over the next 5 years, if anything, would further shrink that. And so an interesting question is going to be for the next administration and the new Congress is whether they want to go back and revisit these caps, and if so, how, and to the extent they don't, how they're going to reprioritize, because obviously we're competing against many other domestic program priorities. The other thing that we're thinking about, and I'll just throw these out as some ideas here, is, and this gets more in, some of this gets more into the policy space than the R&D space, is when you think about market applications and how that might drive technology, you also need to think about the market itself. And particularly in the energy space, and in particular in the electricity space, we're dealing with industries that are very capital intensive. And so not only there's large capital requirements not only to innovate, but also to deploy new technology. We're dealing with an infrastructure that is very long-lived. The capital stock turnover rates are very low. So for example, I'm sure all of you replace your smartphones every maybe 1, 2, 3 years, but you're only going to replace your water heater once every 15 years. And so the question is, how do we get these technology into the marketplace and get the diffusion rate up? The other problem we're dealing with in energy is fundamentally a commodity business. We're looking really hard right now to see how we would think about it. One could add value-added services. Clearly, things like the Internet of Things, potentially, and questions related to reliability, become potentially value-added applications of electricity, where one might begin to think about a different pricing model. We don't know, but other than that, right now, it's really all cost competitive driven. And then last but not least, we're dealing with a regulatory environment that poses a lot of impediments to change. The energy business is very heavily regulated, and we've had various degrees of deregulation in the electricity sector, but we still have some very significant regulation. And so that also poses a significant challenge in thinking about innovation and ultimate deployment. So next steps, we are now, I think, 70 days from the end of the Obama administration. And as a political appointee, my term of office ends on January 20th, although I would just simply point out the last two people that held my position held over from one administration to the next, although I'm not necessarily looking to do that. But nonetheless, a couple things. Right now, there's a meeting going on in Marrakesh. It's the COP22 meeting, which is the Conference of the Parties to the Climate Change Agreement. It's the kind of the follow-on to the Paris Agreement. And next week, the U.S. will be releasing 2 reports there, probably next Wednesday. One is a document that we're calling our mid-century strategy for decarbonization, and it'll have some of the information I showed you here, but in much more detail. The other document that we will be releasing is a very short, very high-level document that we're calling our Mission Innovation Blueprint document that will also begin to frame our portfolio in this application-oriented space. And so I think some of the ideas that I laid out here you'll see in much more detail in those 2 documents. The work that I just described here, within the department, we're going to put together a portfolio plan document that we're going to be for the next administration. But I do know that the Secretary definitely wants to make that a public document, not necessarily an internal document. Another thing that we'll be doing here this next month, and I didn't really talk about this in the presentation, although it really very much relates to the innovation space, is that we'll be producing what we're calling the second round of our quadrennial energy review, looking more at the policy side of electricity issues, questions related to industry structure, business models, regulation, and policy incentives. And then last but not least, I'm hopeful that next week Congress comes back into session for what we call the lame duck session. And we're hopeful that we will get some final action by Congress before they leave in December on our FY27 appropriations requests that I described in this presentation. And while our expectations are that we're not going to get a 20% increase in our budget, we're hoping to get some down payment on many of the initiatives that I talked to you about today. So with that, I think I'll stop here and really would be interested in any comments, questions, discussion, etc. So thank you.
I sent out an invitation to get with you. Is there any questions, comments, or remarks for Joe? Say who you are so we have an idea.
Hey, Joey Lammy, recent PhD grad in PPD. Maybe this is the elephant in the room, but I'm just kind of curious about your long and distinguished career in energy policy. What have you seen in past transitions of power? I mean, is there really a change in government institutions like the Department of Energy, or do you expect things to kind of run more or less the same with a different budget?
No, there have been significant changes, and I've been through, in my career at OMB, I went through 2 of them. And one of them was a change in party. One of them was when the same party, it was just different presidents, so we went from Reagan to Bush. And there typically are significant changes. There were even significant changes when it was within the same party. And I think, given there were not a lot of details in the campaign, but I would expect a different emphasis. I think there'll be some very significant questions about what happens to the Clean Power Plant, for example. And although I didn't talk about our QER report, our QER effort was based around a presumption that in the electricity sector that the Clean Power Plant would be in existence, for example. I think in the research space, the biggest change I've seen between Republican and Democrat administrations has been in the whole question of the government's role. There's a kind of a very strong, I would say very strong consensus, bipartisan consensus that there's an important federal role in funding some of the basic research and education, and in some of the early stage applied R&D, you know, kind of taking proof of concept kind of research. But there's been, in the past, there have been some very big differences between some of the more applied areas and how far the government would support demonstration activities, deployment activities, where the Republicans would typically take the position that that really should be a private sector investment. We shouldn't be using tax dollars to help stimulate that. And the Democratic administrations have been taking a more expansive role in providing incentives there for, again, addressing some of these externality issues, whether it be climate change, environmental, or even questions related to energy security, which we didn't touch on at all. So we don't know. A lot of it will depend upon the personalities of the incoming administrations. I think right now, particularly in the fossil fuel area, there have been some significant differences of views about fossil fuel development, whether it's unconventional natural gas and fracking, coal. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, there could be. But I think the other thing, though, that an incoming administration does not realize is the degrees of freedom that they have to operate are a lot less than what they think they have coming in. And so, for example, during this administration, we've put out somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 energy efficiency standards. Okay, a Trump administration saying, well, we want to deregulate. We don't want government regulation. Well, you cannot very easily unwind those efficiency standards because they're already on the books. Likewise, in some of the research space, a lot of these programs have very strong bipartisan support. And there's a lot of support in Congress. What we found on the innovation agenda is when we talk on the Hill to congressional Republicans, if you talk to them in innovation terms, they're very supportive. Even when you talk to them about climate issues, they're much less so. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, and a lot of it will depend on personality. But we think that, again, an incoming administration that's concerned about infrastructure, investment, and is concerned about innovation, there's a lot here that should fit that framework. Well, I think it actually begins to make the potential linkages clearer, because there are important linkages, and I think that's another area that, frankly, we probably have not pursued as much. I mean, in the transportation area in particular, I mean, if you're thinking about autonomous vehicles and transportation systems, there's very much of there should be a lot of commonality of interest. What DOE brings to the table with these other agencies is that they do not have anywhere near the technological depth that DOE has. And so even though they have a policy interest, they may have a financial interest, they don't have the same technology capability. And so we really do add a dimension there that they don't have.